Hi everyone, it's me, Abdul Rahman, and I'm very thankful to my mentor and a very senior counselor therapist, Zamin Dante. He has been working with people recovering from addictions and mental illness. On his journey, he has also lived and worked with mentally handicapped adults in a number of community-based residential programs. Thank you, Zamin, for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Abdul. So good to be with you. I should just make the caveat that I'm no longer in practice, but still hold these people in my heart deeply.
Thank you. So we'll just let the audience know. So today the topic is addictions searching for a cure. We'll just let people know what addiction is. So it's a compulsive, chronic, physiological and psychological need for a habit-forming substance, behavior, or activity having harmful physical and psychological or social effects and typically causing well-defined symptoms such as anxiety, irritability, tremors, and nausea. So we'll move on to the first slide that says how addiction has physical and psychological components. So what do you think, Zamin, about that?
Yes, addiction is physical, psychological. I would also say spiritual, and even within a society. Once one gets a dependence on people, on places, on things, whether it's sexuality or chemical addiction, little by little it alters the nervous system, it alters the brain, and it's a trap psychologically as you get a dependency on something.
Mm-hmm. So that's great. So like how it can be addiction to chemicals, people, and things, and ideologies and power. Like we see nowadays all over the world, like addiction badly towards power. So and also towards people in relationships.
Yes, I think part of this is that when we feel a deficit inside of ourselves, we look for some kind of chemical substitute to raise us over that deficit. But sometimes we get that feeling, that tweak. It's not just with a chemical, it might be in a group or with an ideological group. In a sense, you transcend or rise over yourself by the group energy.
Mm-hmm.
So one could become addicted to a group itself.
So you're trying to say that the group identity, like a collective identity in itself, can be very addictive.
Oh, absolutely so. I think many of us internally, we're beset by a lot of self-criticism, self-doubt. And when we're with a group that's very supportive, in a way we inflate. We feel better about ourselves. That's a good quality.
Mm-hmm.
But the addictive quality comes when the group starts to exert control over you in order
Mm-hmm.
for you to get that little raise of energy.
Mm-hmm. So this reminds me of the example of Malcolm X. So it happened. It's just like a same scenario on with getting initially into the groups, and then when you act to be a free thinker, and then everything is so different.
Yes, especially with Malcolm X. When he first found the black Muslims, it was really wonderful. He was in prison. He was very depressed. He was miserable and angry with his life. And he saw an exemplar, a person that was a living example for him, a Muslim, a black Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And he joined the Nation of Islam. And for a while, it was very, very good until one day he began to see that not everything was the way it was interpreted to be, and that there were certain corruptions in the organizations and the leadership. And when he began to make waves and was disturbed by that, they began to try to silence him. And at a later stage, of course, he went to Mecca. He saw that Islam was much broader than just the racially charged Islam that he had learned from Elijah Muhammad and the group, the Nation of Islam, and he expanded. But that's the journey of Malcolm X. But at each stage, something was fulfilled, and then at another stage, what was a positive thing turned into something that was not so good, and he had to keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm. That's true. So it kinds of like the cults or groups give identity to people, and also they become addictive on a later stage.
Well, yes, as a matter of fact, the cult as a group one of the things is that people are attracted because they're not feeling very good about themselves, or they have a very fragile identity.
Mm-hmm.
But when they join the group or a tribal identity,
Mm-hmm.
they're inflated, they're buoyed up. The problem comes when they don't, if they have a doubt about what the group is saying, or if they have a doubt about the leadership, then it becomes kind of a cognitive dissonance. There's a troubling within. And then the group tries to anesthetize you to that. And of course, if you continue to make problems, they punish you.
That's very true. We see that all over the world. So, all right. So, Zamin, would you just share about the story of Buddha? How does that relate to our topic of addictions, like addiction searching for a cure?
Yes, it's actually quite a wonderful story, and it relates to trauma too. One thing about the story of Buddha, not even taking this story religiously, but taking it as kind of a guide, because I believe that sacred stories really teach us things beyond a particular religion. Buddha is a prince, and he's raised by his father in a little pleasure garden.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason his father did that is that he wanted his son to become a world emperor.
Mm-hmm.
And he was afraid that if he experienced the world and the suffering in the world, that he would not be an emperor, that he would rather be a world teacher. And that he would be moved by the experience of the world. So his father conspired to keep him locked up. In a way, the garden he was in is the same as the Garden of Eden. It's a childhood. If I could stay perpetually a child and have all of the goodies I like, and of course with Buddha it was also all the pretty girls and all of the foods and everything a prince would have,
mm-hmm.
then, he would not go searching. But one day, the story goes, one of the gods, one of the Hindu gods, he was growing up in that time, left the gate open to the palace. And Buddha wandered out. His name was Gautama. He was a prince at that time before he was called the Buddha. That's a title.
Mm-hmm.
Gautama wandered out with his guard, and very soon he was out in the world and he started seeing things that were very disturbing. In a sense, he had left Eden, he was out in the world, and the first thing that Gautama saw out in the world was a sick person. And he was just mystified. He goes, "What's wrong with this person?" And his guard said, "Oh, prince, that person is ill." And Gautama said, "I had no idea." And they went a little further, and there was a person who was very old and feeble.
Mm-hmm.
And Gautama said, "What's that?" And he goes, "Oh, Lord, that's age. That's old age. People suffer a great deal. They get old. They're sick much of the time. Their bones don't work. They ache."
Mm-hmm.
And he was very disturbed. And then lastly, he saw a group of people carrying a corpse.
Oh, my God. Mm-hmm.
And the smell of the corpse, you can picture India in the 3rd century.
I know. Mm-hmm.
And the smell of the corpse was there. And we're going to have to hold Gautama was out walking, and he saw finally a corpse. And if you remember, in India, in the heat of India, a corpse really smells bad.
Yeah, that's true.
And he was totally shocked by the face of death.
Mm-hmm.
He says, "What is this?" And he said, "Oh, teacher, Lord, this is death." And the young prince was so shocked, he just sat down and just being totally disturbed and traumatized by the first sight of these things. And the next person who came by was a wandering holy person, sannyasin, who had renounced the world. And the prince said, "What's this?" And his guard said, "Oh, that's a person who's renounced the world and is seeking the cure for suffering."
Mm-hmm. More
So
like
Gautama,
a yogi or a spiritual person.
Pardon?
So it was more like a yogi or a spiritual person.
Yes, a person who had renounced the world, a very spiritual person, like a saintly person.
Mm-hmm.
And Gautama decided to go out, leave being a prince, and to search his spirituality, trying to find the cure for the suffering of the world, the cure for the trauma. And that the idea of trauma really leads you to one of the roots of addiction, how people can be traumatized at an early age and really don't know how to soothe themselves.
Exactly, that's true. Mm-hmm.
So they find themselves addicted to a chemical or alcohol or to a person, whatever it is, just trying to soothe.
Mm-hmm.
And so the task in addictions recovery is to help a person find a way to be able to soothe themselves, but also to find that in a group of people in healthy relationships.
Hmm. So like someone with the very with a very child ego, I would say that not developed self, not experienced any suffering before. So for them, it can be really a bad addiction towards chemicals. Uh,
Well, it's like a person who hasn't suffered, who gets
exactly.
very traumatized.
Hmm.
They may not have a way of holding that trauma. Now, think multiple traumas. I'm going to list things like being raped or being in a war or seeing someone murdered in front of you or sexual abuse
Hmm.
or witnessing terrible crimes. A child is shattered. Even an adult can be shattered. You sometimes see something that doesn't fit into your system of belief, your sense of security. But at a later stage too, people could be shattered. It's not just in childhood.
Hmm. So,
That's one of the roots of the addiction. The other is probably pleasure.
mhm.
Very often, I grew up in the 60s and 70s. You would go to a party and there would be a great deal of pleasure, and you'd enjoy whether it was alcohol or marijuana or something of that nature,
Mhm.
and just feeling up and feeling connected to people. So some people got stuck in it, though. Some people went through it, experienced it, moved on. Others got caught up in that lifestyle, and the only time that they began to feel good or feel normal was when they were using something.
That makes sense. So it would be like, do you think that the TA model and the contamination of child ego has something to do like with addiction?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely so. Basically, let me start a little bit with TA, just to
Hmm.
explain to people who may not be so aware of that. There are three ego states. And when we say ego, it doesn't mean like a narcissistic, you got to get rid of your ego, but
Hmm.
just states of consciousness.
Yep.
That's a very different meaning in the West than in the East.
Hmm.
And there are three states. One is a parental state, which would be the Freudian superego.
Super ego. Yep.
So it's all the messages from your parent about, keeping your hands clean and what a good religious person is and what good behavior is. In a healthy sense, it's that. In an unhealthy sense, it's what we would call a critical parent.
Hmm.
So, what's wrong with you? You'll never be anything. Why aren't you like your brother? Oh, who's ever seen a child as stupid as you?
Hmm.
It's the critical parent.
Hmm.
And so many people are tormented by a feeling of inadequacy, of never being good enough. And what an addiction can do is it can quiet that voice. So it puts
Quite that blaming parent ego.
yes, for a time.
Hmm.
And then what happens is the child takes hold of the adult. The
Hmm.
adult is the decision-making part of the self.
Hmm.
So the child says, this feels pretty good. Let's get rid of the critical parent. So you get rid of the parent, you exile it, you're in the Garden of Eden for a while, but then when the addiction wears off, whether it's sex or alcohol or power over another person, that can happen too, that's an addiction. That ego state comes back that's critical, but it comes back double, and it says, not only are you a mess up, but you just messed up just now. You're an
Uh,
addict, you're an alcoholic.
that's we see exactly happening in the real lives, like a child, when the child states get contaminated according to the TA model, it overtakes the adult. And when someone do something which is very immoral or unethical, then again after that, when he comes to the normal state, that's the critical or the blaming parent ego hitting the child again, right? That's what happens.
Oh, yeah. And especially if you've grown up in a household where the critical parent has been very, very strong,
Hmm.
the blaming is amplified. It's like a voice inside of your head that you can't shut up. That's what
Uh-huh.
happens when it gets internalized.
So
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 the super, yeah,
so here's the addiction. So here addictions help like minimizing that voice.
yeah, I'll say it anesthetizes that voice
Hmm.
and makes that voice go away for a while. But with an addiction, as you use the addiction over time, you build a tolerance.
Hmm.
That means it takes more and more of the same drug to get you high. And then after a while, you're not even getting high, you're just feeling normal. So you'll use drugs to feel normal, not even to get high, but if you don't get them, you start to feel sick.
That's
And
true.
that's
That's
the
what happened.
withdrawal. And that's one of the part of the definition of addiction, is that when you withdraw the substance or the substance is not available, you start to get sick.
I see. That's so. Let's see what we have next with the question. It's so yeah. I always wondered, like, does the defense mechanisms have anything to do with addiction, trauma, and obsession, compulsion, and psychological abuse? Because that's what happens, right? Defense mechanism. Uh, People like go into denial or rationalize that, or any of the defense mechanism. So does it they have anything to do with addiction?
Oh, of course, I think like if someone's addicted, they become masters of defense mechanisms. There's an old AA saying that denial is not just a river in Egypt. It's
Uh huh.
denial, Denial.
Uh huh.
And so people become masters at denial, masters of deception, masters of lies. And the problem is you get more and more trapped in a lie. The addiction itself becomes an illusory lie. And after a while, if you progress long enough, you don't really know what reality is. It's kind of a psychosis. It's a madness.
I see. So it has a so it's almost running from the reality and going into the denial or any of the defense mechanisms, and that's where people also go with addiction, right?
Yes, and there's a compulsion behind it, or an obsession, which means that you can't stop.
Uh
And so as
huh.
much as people say use your will, you may not be able to stop. Now, granted, will is a part of recovery. You've got to apply your will. But I think what people begin to realize is that they have limited control and power over things. As a matter of fact, that's where addiction recovery begins,
Mm-hmm.
is an acknowledgement of one's powerlessness or the limits of one's power.
So,
And at that point, one needs the help of others, whether it's a group or a therapist or someone that's going to help you in your path. It actually takes a community to heal a person that has an addiction.
mhm. I believe that that's the very next question I had in my mind about that. It's the effect of peer groups on fostering addictions, like the creation of counterculture, peer cultures, alternate identity, sometimes a means to rebel. So, what do you think about that?
Yes, well, it's very interesting because groups are parts of healing, but groups also help to create addictions. There's a power of peers. Like, for example, let's say that I was with a group of people and I was very attracted to them. They were very popular, but they also had poor moral decisions. They stole, they abused people, whatever. If I didn't have a strong enough sense of myself and value, I might be pulled into their behavior. So especially when you're using chemicals or alcohol or something of that nature, it weakens the ability to discriminate and make intelligent decisions.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of leaves one in a dreamier state, and it's easier to cross boundaries, so you're less inhibited. You've
That
put the
makes sense.
critic to sleep. You've also put your moral sense to sleep, if you had a moral sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Again, some children grow up in families, at least in America, I can comment on that, where they didn't really have a very good moral foundation. It was a broken home, maybe both parents working, sometimes only one parent, where the parents were addicts or struggling very, very hard just to survive,
Mm-hmm.
and there wasn't very good instruction. So that moral sense may not have been there very strong to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
In others, being with a group helps you to go over it.
So it's just like they find a safer place where they resonate with the other people, and that's the place where they find peace, and that's all where they go for addictions.
Well, it's a little like a tribal identity. You find your tribe, and if you blend in with the tribe, it's easier to do things. It's
Uh-huh.
easier to socialize. It might be easier to do something criminal. It's easier to get drugs and alcohol because that's just what everyone's into. If it's a bunch of people that are sexually promiscuous, it's easier to be promiscuous within a group of people that are sexually promiscuous.
Hmm.
The group reinforces a behavioral norm for good or ill.
So it can be either way. It can be in a bad way, and it can also be like healing from addiction as well.
Yes, yes, and that's true. And I think if you're in a group that's about helping to people to develop good character and good virtue, and also to not be so at risk with the vulnerabilities of addiction. If you're caught in alcohol or drugs or other things, like like you're a person who has a gambling addiction, you can gamble away your household. People have done that.
That's true.
Um, and it's like basically you can't stop. So to be in a group of people where you could acknowledge your weakness and depend on others for help and to learn how to help others is what keeps you sane and sober.
Mm-hmm.
Addiction in a way is a form of insanity.
I see. That's a nice
Okay, the
word for
further it
addiction.
progresses, the more and more insane it gets.
That's true. So so I believe that's our last slide, and that's the, I would say, last but not the least, the most important form: healing from addictions, like cure for suffering in community and conscious suffering, and Jung's contra spiritum, spirit versus spiritum, and AA model. So, what do you think about that?
Yes, Carl Jung is wonderful. He's the depth psychologist that talks a great deal about the shadow self. And so he looks at things not just as saying this is good or bad, but on a deeper level. And one thing that Jung wrote, he wrote to Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson was the founder of AA. And AA is very interesting. It's one form of addiction recovery, but it has many valuable lessons to teach. And Bill Wilson, just to digress for a moment, developed this in the 1930s when he himself was severely addicted to alcohol and had ruined his life multiple times and was kind of a person who was on the last ditch of recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a spiritual awakening, and something just inside of him said, what I've got to do to survive is to go talk to another alcoholic and to help that person.
Mm-hmm.
So he found another sick alcoholic, as sick as him, in a hospital, went to visit him, and the two of them just began to talk about their lives and their addiction, and they helped each other to stay sober one day at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And gradually, these two men helping each other turned into AA. The group gathered into a larger group. And basically what happened with Jung, to get back to Jung, is that Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, wrote to him a letter in the 1960s, and Jung wrote back. And basically Jung looked at addiction as a kind of spirit. Now, when I say possession, I don't necessarily mean that ghosts have possessed the person, but in a way it's a little bit like a jinn. It has a life of its own once it gets started. It will tear up your life. At the same time, that same kind of addictive quality can also be very creative. So some people that are very creative also may be addictive. There are two sides of a Greek god. There's a Greek god called Dionysus. Now, this is not Greek religion, but the Greeks used the images of gods to describe psychological states. And they said addiction, in this case, alcoholism. Dionysus is the god of wine. He has two sides. His light side, and he's also the god of theater, believe it or not, in Greece, ancient Greece. His light side was involved with joyfulness, playfulness, creativity, art, magic. His dark side had to do with ripping apart and destroying, tearing down things. So his devotees would rip apart small animals and kill people in the wilderness. Very horrible. But on the lighter side, theater comes out of him too. So Jung is talking about spirit in two ways. One way is what you would think religiously as spirit is something inspiring and something that's very light.
Yep, true.
But the other side of spirit is very dark. It's shattering and fragmenting.
Like
and
more like a Plutonian heat.
Pardon?
Like Plutonian heat. It's very similar to that. Destruction and reconstruction.
Yes. But with Jung especially, what he realized was that in order to balance out those destructive aspects, you had to be able to pull in the light and pull in something spiritual. So he was writing to Bill Wilson about that, because the AA program is essentially a spiritual program. When I say that, I'm going to differentiate from religion. Religion is basically about an orthodoxy, about a particular scripture and practice, where AA was more about discovering a spirituality between people that's more revelatory in a sense, that you
Mm-hmm.
discover God or higher power through the interactions of helping one another. Now, I want to explain the word higher power. Bill Wilson also used that, and that was borrowed from William James, the American psychologist who wrote about psychology of religion, as a matter of fact,
Mm-hmm.
in around 1900. And in this psychology, William James talked about higher power. So it's not defined by religion, it's more defined by an experience. Not even an abstraction, but an experience. So one is raised up by something. One feels the light inherent in something. One sees a mercy extended toward one. A Christian would say, oh, well, that's Christ. But in AA, it's no, if you're a Christian, you can call it Christ.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a Muslim, you could call it Allah.
Mm-hmm. That's
And
true.
if you're a
That's true.
secular person, you can just say there's something remarkable happening in this group.
Mm-hmm.
The beauty of the community that was founded was that it was a community that could recognize God in all these different forms and not even call it God, but call it mercy or help or compassion.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a way to bring different people together, many of whom are religious in different traditions. And I've seen Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, and Buddhists, and other religion. And I've also seen people who have no religion but would describe themselves as spiritual. But the bottom line that I think is that regardless of what name you give it, if it's an ethical tradition, if you're learning ethics and the treatment of others in a certain way, then I would call it a spiritual path. In essence, you're discovering God within the other, or you're discovering virtue within the other, or you're discovering what's valuable in humanity within the other. And that is a way of the heart.
That makes sense. That seems like more like a spiritual procedure for healing from addiction. So how about like the AA model, like the steps? So would you just give a brief introduction on few steps of AA model that could help people?
Yes, absolutely so. And I think it's quite remarkable. There are 12 steps. And basically the first step, I'm going to break it into parts. It's like peace with your higher power, or peace with God, if you want to call it that.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And basically, you come through brokenness, not through
Mm-hmm.
pride. And that's the one thing that determines the beginning of a spiritual path, but also the path of addictions recovery,
Mm-hmm.
which I'll call the spiritual path in its own right. It's not necessarily a religious path, but it's a spiritual path.
Mm-hmm.
The first step is brokenness, and you realize that there's a powerlessness that you have in the face of that substance, in the face of that trauma, in the face of some obsession, a chemical, a personality addiction, an addiction to power. You're out of control. And therefore, because you're powerless, you realize that it's going to take something that's beyond yourself to give you some help.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that something might be many things. It may be a faith in God or a faith in the universe. It's a faith in your fellow human beings, the people in the group. It
Mm-hmm.
might be just the faith in nature. You look out in nature and you say, the world's a horrible, cruel place, but I watch the leaves come back on the trees. It's predictable. I watch the beauty of nature. There's something that's constant. So you are really ascribing to something that's beyond human suffering, or something that's constant, to begin to have faith in.
Mm-hmm.
And for people who've been betrayed or gone through terrible childhoods, terrible lives, been on the streets, to trust someone is a real big step. And you don't do it unless you're so powerless and sick
That's true.
that you're not going to get well unless you trust someone.
Mm-hmm.
And as they would say, why go to the doctor unless you're sick?
That's true.
Okay, so that's the story of the Buddha too. He realized that he was sick and he began to search for a cure. Step 3 is basically being willing to make an inward step towards surrender, to trust the process,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's trusting God or the group or just the process of AA or the 12 steps. You're just taking a step into the unknown. Now, the next steps are called peace with ourselves, and they're 4 steps. And the first one involves a self-examination. It means making an inventory of oneself. What harms has one done to another? What harms or angers does one have within oneself? What types of things is one guilty of? On the other side, one also can make a positive inventory about one's good qualities, and one needs to do both.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next step is very hard. To the things that we've done wrong, it means admitting what we've done wrong to one human being. It's often called a sponsor. It could be a therapist. In some cases, it's your Christian minister or your imam.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it's confession.
Confession.
Someone
Yeah.
says, well, what do I need to confess to another human being? I can confess to God. Well, it didn't work when you did that. And you did that 30 times. And you're still feeling sick.
Mm-hmm.
And so you say, I've got to try another path. I've got to break the silence.
So that also brings self-integrity, like doing that confession and bringing the integrity back, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely so. And basically what we're saying is that something in one's integrity has been either by a trauma or an act that we've done, an act of violence somewhat to ourselves or other.
Mm-hmm.
And so like searching for that integrity, it's the start of that process, making that confession of a wrongdoing. And sometimes that's done just by writing, in other occasions, writing a letter to someone. I've got to admit something I did years ago, or this has been troubling me for years. I've been angry at you for years, or I've judged you for years, and I'm really sorry. I'm finally realizing it's wrong, or I stole something from you. Or in some cases, with people, they've done terrible crimes, and it means that they need to have a lawyer to help them do this.
That would just, they would be free from guilt. It was just like releasing the energy, and that can be so soothing.
Yes, it can be, but there's often a consequence to admitting a wrongdoing. Someone might forgive you. Someone may say, well, that's fine, but you stole something and there's 10 years of prison.
That they could be more critical towards you.
But the thing is, you may be so sick from what's making you sick that you'll say, I'm willing to take the consequence.
I see.
And
So
that's why people come forth.
I see.
But you need the help of the community to help you to have discernment about that, and wiser people to help you have discernment about that and how to do that.
Great. So, so I believe that next step, which I believe I've learned a lot from you about adab, like that's a new way of being and learning. So how do you think that helps in addiction?
Okay. Well, first, I just want to finish one thing, which means that finally we make amends for what we've done, and then we learn to participate in a community of people that are in recovery, that are trying to find a greater spirituality. Now, these are not perfect people. Let's not think that this is some spiritual group on the highest plane, but sometimes it is. That's paradoxical. There are moments that someone who's been very sick and very ill, something will come out of them that's so pure, you think that you're with a saintly being, although you know that they were a prostitute. But there's something so wise and beautiful or redemptive that comes out of their spirit that you're just literally in awe. But to learn, the word adab, of course, is used, I guess, in religious circles and Sufi circles to mean some kind of a spiritual etiquette or a divine manner, was the way that I first heard that word, to learn to practice a divine manner. You don't do that through a book. You learn that by being around courteous, gentle, considerate people. So those people, I would call them elders in a group or even in a recovery group. They're people far along that have learned to be truthful. They've learned to be courteous. If they make mistakes, they've promptly admitted their wrongdoing, have asked for forgiveness. They're not haughty over other people. They listen and help other people. In the presence of those people, you begin to get recovery. It's not so much you intellectually get it, but it's almost like you get it through contact.
That's true.
Like a spirituality. If you're around someone who has a great spirituality, you feel something by being in their presence. And you could read 1,000 books about religion and spirituality, but if you haven't been around someone who's saintly, it's just nice stuff.
It's a different experience. And I believe the essence of this AA model can be really quoted well with the serenity prayer. What do you think with that? Like,
Oh, this
yeah,
yes, the Serenity Prayer is brilliant. That's actually from a Christian theologian.
exactly.
Right? What is his name?
It's Reinhold.
Yes, Reinhold Niebuhr. Right.
Yep, yep.
And he really did a lot of stuff on nuclear disarmament and peace work. And I would say that the one theme that runs throughout recovery is making peace with others and making peace with yourself. But one of the things that we struggle with is in life, we don't know how much we can control and how much is beyond our control.
True.
And we are trying to control what we can't control. We're trying to ignore what we should be changing. And the Serenity Prayer is very, very beautiful. It handles both ends of it. It's basically, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
That's so beautiful. I believe it helps people. I've literally seen people getting real help from this. It's just like very soothing to the mind.
Oh, it is, and especially in a moment where you're feeling very overwhelmed and sick and angry and want to fight someone or want to cry. And, the soul has to kind of sort out what it can change. And you have to try to change what you can change, but there's some things you cannot. And just to have the peace of mind to accept what you can't change. Not everything can be changed.
It's I believe it's a very hard task for people suffering, and this really helps. So I have a last question. I believe I skipped that before, but I would ask you. So do you think that the suffering of ethical people differs from, I won't say unethical, but people with low superego or less moral? So do suffering differs for both of the groups, and does getting into the addiction differs for both of them?
Well, I missed your last question. Is getting into the addiction?
So yeah, I was saying that, like, the getting into addiction is same for both of them, or does it differ?
Oh, I think there's similarities and there are probably differences. And again, remember, someone who doesn't have a great moral standing can also awaken to be much higher than you or I. But they're born into a state of sleepfulness, the Sufis would say, or they're just not aware of other human beings. They've grown up in a household that was abusive. They've been shut down. They discover addictions, and some people by nature are more cruel. But sometimes when people get sick, it opens up their beings and opens up their hearts. Now, here's the difference between someone that has a very acute moral sense and someone who doesn't. Someone who's acutely moral, and you can also be overly moral if you've been raised and punished a great deal and have a great sense of perfectionism, then the morality is not really a healthy morality. It's almost an abusive morality. It aims at superiority in a way, because if I could be superior, then I could stop beating myself. But if I was superior, then I could start beating you.
That's true.
Okay, so that's kind of an unhealthy morality. But for a person that has a basic healthy morality, when they make a mistake, their conscience bothers them. And if you learn through your addiction to put your conscience to sleep, it keeps coming back at you if you had awakened a conscience to begin with. But it takes more and more of that chemical to put it to sleep. Let's say that you had a fairly good conscience, but you were so addicted that you had to turn to crime, or even in some cases prostitution. And I mean that for men and women. In order to provide the addiction, which is the most powerful force in their life. The addiction in all essence becomes God. It's a God. It demands constant sacrifice. And so it dominates the life. And if you didn't have much conscience, you can still suffer greatly because of the lifestyle. You're out on the streets, you lose your job, you get into all sorts of fights, you're in bad neighborhoods, you lie, cheat, and steal. Most people don't want to deal with you. You physically get ill, your body ages. At a very early age, if you've been using for years, you look 30 years older. So yes, people suffer, but they suffer differently. And if I've been part of a gang and I rob another gang, it doesn't bother me. But if I was to rob one of the members of my own gang, it might.
So it's like having a healthy conscience and less developed conscience, maybe, or developing a judge within And that comes with a life experience, I believe.
Yes, and of course, as we said before, you can have a conscience that's too developed. And so every little tiny thing is a perfectionism.
Hmm.
And so the job therapeutically is different. In that case, it's to broaden the sense of humanity to realize that, my God, we're all humble, we all make mistakes.
Hmm.
Uh, in another case where someone has never developed a value system, the job therapeutically is to help them to develop a value system.
Hmm. That's great. Yep. So I believe that comes to an end, and I would really like to thank Zamin for joining me on the podcast. And it was pleasure, Zamin, talking to you and learning on
Oh,
addiction and journey for cure.
oh, thank you so very much. And I also want to thank all of the people that I worked with, whether they were mentally ill or addicted, that really were my teachers. You learn a lot by serving people and you learn from them. So
That's
thank you so much, Abdul.
Thank you, Zamin. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.